The German Shepherd hadn't moved in 53 hours. Deputy Sarah Chen noticed him first on Monday morning, a dark shape against the golden grass at mile marker 47. She'd been running late for her shift, coffee sloshing in its cup holder, when his silhouette registered in her peripheral vision. Just a dog, she told herself, probably waiting for a rabbit to emerge from the brush. But something about the way he sat, rigid, focused, like a soldier refusing to abandon his post, made her foot hover over the brake. She didn't stop. She was already 12 minutes behind, and Sheriff Patterson had been in a mood all week. Besides, dogs wandered these rural highways constantly. Farm dogs, strays, hunting hounds, separated from their packs. They always found their way home. Still, as Sarah accelerated past, she glanced in her rearview mirror. The dog hadn't turned to watch her go, hadn't flinched at the sound of her engine. He remained frozen, staring at something in the tall grass just beyond the shoulder. What was he looking at? The question nagged at her through her entire shift. Through the noise complaint on Maple Street, the fender bender outside the hardware store, the endless paperwork that always seemed to multiply on her desk. By the time she drove home that evening, exhaustion pressing against her temples, she'd almost forgotten about him. Then her headlights swept across mile marker 47. He was still there. Before we continue, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. And trust me, this one will make you think twice, because it could happen to anyone. Sarah's hands tightened on the wheel. The dog sat in exactly the same position, as if the hours between her two passings had been compressed into a single frozen moment. The setting sun threw his shadow long across the pavement, and something about that silhouette, so utterly alone against the fading sky, made her chest ache in a way she didn't expect. She slowed, watching him in her mirror until he disappeared around a curve. "Go back," a voice whispered. "Something's wrong." But she was tired. So tired. And she'd learned, in her 3 years as a deputy, that not every mystery needed solving. Sometimes dogs just waited. Sometimes people just disappeared. Sometimes the universe offered questions without answers, and the only sane response was to keep driving. Sarah went home, microwaved leftover pasta, and fell asleep to the sound of rain beginning to fall. She dreamed of the dog. In her dream, he turned to look at her, and his eyes held something she couldn't name. Not accusation exactly, but something close. Something that felt like a plea. When she woke, it was still dark, and the rain had become a storm. Tuesday morning arrived gray and waterlogged. Sarah drove to work through puddles that sprayed against her windshield, the wipers working overtime against the relentless drizzle. She told herself she wouldn't look. She told herself it didn't matter. But as mile marker 47 approached, her eyes moved of their own accord. The dog sat in the downpour, water streaming down his black and tan coat, and he hadn't moved an inch. This time Sarah pulled over. She sat in her cruiser for a long moment, watching him through the rain-streaked window. He was a beautiful animal, clearly purebred, with the distinctive saddle marking and alert ears of a well-bred German Shepherd. His coat, despite the rain, looked healthy. No visible injuries, no signs of distress beyond the obvious strangeness of his behavior. He should have sought shelter. Any sensible animal would have found cover hours ago, when the first drops began to fall. Instead, he sat in the mud, trembling slightly but otherwise motionless, his attention fixed on that same spot in the grass. Sarah opened her door, and the cold rain hit her like a slap. "Hey there," she called softly, taking a cautious step toward him. "Hey, boy, you okay?" The dog's ears twitched. That was the only acknowledgement he gave her. He didn't turn, didn't wag his tail, didn't show any of the normal signs of canine greeting. He just sat. Sarah moved closer, her boots squelching in the mud. She was a dozen feet away now, close enough to see the collar around his neck. Not a regular collar, Something more substantial. Black nylon, with what looked like a badge or patch attached. Her heart stuttered. She knew that collar. She'd seen it 100 times at training exercises and community events and the annual law enforcement memorial service. It was a canine handler's collar, the kind worn by police dogs throughout the county. This wasn't a stray. This was a working dog, which meant he belonged to someone, which meant someone should have been looking for him. "Easy," Sarah murmured, crouching slowly. "Easy, boy. Where's your partner?" The dog finally turned his head, and Sarah felt the breath leave her lungs. His eyes were ancient, exhausted, filled with a grief so profound that she felt it like a physical blow. He looked at her the way her grandmother had looked at her grandfather's casket, with the hollow acceptance of someone who had already surrendered to loss but couldn't bring themselves to leave. Then he turned back to the grass and resumed his vigil. Sarah straightened, suddenly cold in a way that had nothing to do with the rain. She took another step forward, angling to see what he was watching. The grass was tall here, overgrown where the county mowers hadn't reached. It swayed in the wind, heavy with water, revealing nothing but mud and weeds and... Sarah stopped breathing. A hand. Pale and motionless, barely visible through the green stalks. Someone was lying in that grass. Someone was lying there, and they weren't moving, and this dog had been sitting beside them for nearly 2 days. Sarah's radio was in her hand before she consciously reached for it. Her voice, when it came, sounded strange and distant, like it belonged to someone else. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. I need emergency services at mile marker 47 on County Road 9. We have a possible..." She hesitated. The word lodged in her throat like a stone. A possible fatality. The dog heard her. She knew he did, because something in his posture shifted, a slight lowering of his head, a tremor that ran through his sodden frame. He understood. On some level, in whatever way dogs understand these things, he knew what she'd found. He'd known all along. Sarah moved toward the body, her training taking over even as her mind reeled. She pushed through the grass, mud sucking at her boots, rain running down her face like tears. The hand became an arm, the arm became a shoulder, the shoulder became... She stopped at the edge of a shallow ravine, and the world tilted sideways. A man lay at the bottom, maybe 10 feet down. He was wearing civilian clothes, jeans, a dark jacket, but his build was unmistakable. Broad shoulders, military posture, even in stillness. A face she'd seen at a dozen department functions, usually smiling, usually with a German shepherd pressed against his side. Officer Marcus Webb, canine handler, 14 years on the force, father of 2. Sarah's knees buckled. She caught herself on a fence post, splinters biting into her palm, and forced herself to look, really look, at the scene below. The ravine was steep, but not deep. An easy climb for a healthy person. But Marcus wasn't climbing. Marcus wasn't doing anything. He lay crumpled at the bottom like a marionette with cut strings, one arm bent at an angle that made Sarah's stomach lurch. Had he fallen? Had his car gone off the road? She scanned the area but saw no vehicle, no skid marks, no sign of how he'd ended up here. Unless he'd been walking, unless he'd been out here for some reason, training maybe, or just exercising his dog, and something had gone wrong. Something had definitely gone wrong. "Marcus," Sarah called, her voice cracking. "Marcus, can you hear me?" No response. The rain fell harder, drumming against the leaves, filling the silence where his voice should have been. Behind her the dog whined, a single broken sound that cut through the storm like a blade. Sarah turned to look at him, this faithful creature who had sat beside his fallen partner for days, refusing food, refusing shelter, refusing to abandon the man he served even when that man could no longer rise to meet him. The dog's name surfaced from some distant corner of her memory. She'd heard it at community events, shouted across training fields, murmured in the quiet moments between exercises. "Atlas," she whispered. The dog's ears lifted, his tail moved, just once, just slightly, before going still again. And Sarah understood with a certainty that settled into her bones that Atlas had been waiting. Not for rescue, not for help. He'd been waiting for someone to find them. He'd been standing guard over his partner's body, because that was what he'd been trained to do. And he would have stayed there until he died if that's what it took. The question was, how had Marcus ended up here, and why hadn't anyone reported him missing? Sarah reached for her radio again, but before she could speak, she heard something that made her blood freeze. A groan. Faint, barely audible over the rain. It was coming from the ravine. Marcus Webb was still alive. Atlas had smelled the blood before the fall. It was subtle at first. A copper thread woven into the familiar scent of his partner's skin. Marcus always smelled like coffee and gun oil and the lavender detergent his wife used on their clothes. But that morning, 3 days ago now, there had been something else. Something wrong. Atlas had tried to communicate his concern in the only ways he knew. He'd pressed closer during their walk, nosed at Marcus's hand, whined softly when the man stumbled on the uneven ground. But Marcus had just laughed and scratched behind his ears. "Getting old, buddy," Marcus had said, his voice carrying that strange, breathless quality it had developed over the past few weeks. "Both of us, I guess." They'd been walking their usual route, the stretch of County Road 9 that ran past the old Mueller farm, where the rabbits were plentiful and the ground was soft enough for aging joints. Marcus had started taking these walks after the doctors had said, whatever the doctors had said. Atlas didn't understand human words the way he understood human emotions, but he'd understood the fear that had rolled off Marcus in waves after that appointment, the resignation, the desperate need for normalcy. So they walked. Every morning before Marcus's shift, they walked this road together, and Atlas pretended not to notice how his partner's pace had slowed, how his breath came harder, how sometimes his hand trembled when he reached for the leash. That morning, Marcus had stopped suddenly. His hand had gone to his chest, fingers pressing against his heart, and the copper smell had grown stronger. "Atlas," Marcus had said, and his voice was different now, thin, scared. "Atlas, something's—" He never finished the sentence. Atlas had watched his partner crumple like a man made of paper, had lunged for him even as gravity pulled Marcus toward the edge of the ravine. His teeth had caught the sleeve of Marcus's jacket, had held for one desperate moment, but the fabric tore, and Marcus tumbled down into the darkness, and Atlas was left standing at the edge with nothing but scraps of cloth in his mouth. He'd tried to follow. The instinct was overwhelming, to stay with his partner, to protect him, to offer whatever comfort his presence could provide. But the ravine walls were steep and slick with mud, and every attempt sent Atlas sliding back to the top, his claws scrabbling uselessly against the earth. So he'd done the only thing he could. He sat down, and he waited. The first car passed within an hour. Atlas watched it approach, hope flickering in his chest, but it swept by without slowing. Then another, and another. By nightfall, he'd counted 37 vehicles, and not one had stopped. He understood, in some dim way, that humans moved too fast. They lived in their metal boxes, eyes fixed on the road ahead, minds somewhere else entirely. They didn't smell the blood. They didn't feel the wrongness. They just drove. Night fell and the temperature dropped, and Atlas pressed himself flat against the ground to conserve warmth. He could hear Marcus breathing at the bottom of the ravine, shallow, irregular breaths that sometimes stopped for terrifying moments before resuming. Each pause made Atlas's heart seize. Each resumption let him breathe again. He thought about his training. The hundreds of hours he'd spent learning to track, to search, to protect. He'd been taught to find people, to alert his handler to danger, to respond to commands with instant precision. But no one had taught him what to do when his handler was the one who needed finding. No one had taught him how to wait. The second day was worse. The rain came, cold and relentless, soaking through his coat until he couldn't remember what it felt like to be dry. His stomach cramped with hunger. He hadn't eaten since the morning before, but he couldn't bring himself to hunt. Leaving meant abandoning Marcus, and abandoning Marcus was impossible. So he stayed. Through the downpour, through the wind, through the long hours when the only sound was the drum of rain on grass and the distant thunder of passing cars. He stayed because Marcus had chosen him. Atlas still remembered that day, years ago now, when he'd been just a pup in a kennel full of other pups. The trainers had brought a parade of officers through, letting each one observe the young dogs, evaluate their potential. Most of the officers had looked at Atlas and moved on. He was smaller than his littermates, quieter, less flashy, but Marcus had stopped. Knelt down, looked into Atlas's eyes with an intensity that had felt like recognition. "This one," Marcus had said. "This is my partner." The trainers had hesitated. They'd recommended other dogs, dogs with better pedigrees, dogs who'd scored higher on the initial assessments. But Marcus had been stubborn. "You don't choose a partner based on a score," he'd said. "You choose them because something in them speaks to something in you. This dog has heart. I can see it." He'd been right. Through years of training, years of service, years of danger and triumph and long, quiet nights, Atlas had proven him right. They'd found missing children together. They'd tracked fugitives through swamps and forests. They'd stood side by side at traffic stops that could have turned deadly, each trusting the other with his life. And now Marcus was dying at the bottom of a ravine, and Atlas couldn't do anything but sit in the rain and wait for someone, anyone, to notice. The third day dawned gray and cold. Atlas's muscles had locked into a permanent ache, and his vision blurred at the edges from exhaustion. He'd stopped counting cars. He'd stopped hoping for anything specific. He simply existed in a state of suspended grief, holding vigil over the man who had given him purpose. Then the cruiser slowed. Atlas felt it before he saw it, that subtle change in the air when a vehicle deviated from the expected pattern. His ears swiveled toward the sound, tracking the deceleration, the crunch of tires on gravel. Someone had stopped. He didn't move, didn't allow himself to hope. Too many cars had slowed only to accelerate again, their drivers dismissing him as just another roadside oddity. But this one was different. This one parked. This one opened its door. A woman's voice, soft and cautious. "Hey there. Hey, boy. You okay?" Atlas's ears twitched, but he didn't turn. Couldn't turn. If he looked away from the ravine, even for a moment, it would feel like betrayal, like giving up. The woman moved closer. He could smell her now. Coffee, synthetic fabric, the metallic tang of a gun in a holster. Another officer. One of their own. "Easy, easy, boy. Where's your partner?" Partner. The word hit him like a physical blow. She knew. She'd seen his collar and understood what it meant. Atlas turned, finally, and let her see what he was carrying. 3 days of fear and grief and desperate hope, all of it written in his eyes. He watched her face change as she read him, watched the understanding dawn. Then she moved past him toward the grass, and he knew she'd find what he'd been guarding. The next few minutes were a blur of radio chatter and distant sirens. Atlas heard it all from his post at the edge of the ravine, unable to look away from the spot where Marcus had fallen. The woman, her name was Sarah, he'd heard her say, had scrambled down the slope and was kneeling beside his partner, her hands moving over his body with professional urgency. "He's breathing," she called up. Weak pulse. Possible cardiac event. We need that ambulance now. Cardiac event. Atlas didn't know those words, but he understood the fear behind them. Something was wrong with Marcus's heart. Something had been wrong for a while, and Atlas had smelled it, and he hadn't known what to do. The ambulance arrived in a scream of sirens. Paramedics flooded down the slope, carrying equipment Atlas didn't recognize. They worked on Marcus for what felt like hours, pressing, injecting, attaching wires and tubes that beeped and hummed with mechanical urgency. Atlas wanted to go to him. Every instinct screamed at him to push through these strangers, to press his body against Marcus's, to offer whatever warmth and comfort he could. But something held him back, some dim understanding that the humans needed space to work, that his presence right now might be a hindrance rather than a help. So he waited. Again, still. Finally, they lifted Marcus onto a stretcher. His face was pale as paper, but his chest still rose and fell, and that was enough. That was everything. As they carried him up the slope, Marcus's eyes fluttered open. Unfocused at first, searching blindly through the rain and confusion. Then they found Atlas. "Hey, buddy," Marcus whispered. His voice was barely audible, but Atlas heard it like a shout. "You stayed." Atlas's tail moved. Just once. Just slightly. "You stayed," Marcus said again, and something that might have been a smile crossed his face. "Good boy." They loaded him into the ambulance, and the doors closed, and the sirens started again. Atlas stood in the rain and watched the vehicle disappear around the curve, carrying his partner toward whatever came next. Sarah appeared beside him. She was soaked, mud-streaked, trembling with cold and adrenaline. But when she looked at Atlas, her eyes were gentle. "Come on," she said softly, opening the back door of her cruiser. "Let's get you warm. We'll go see him together." Atlas hesitated. The ravine still pulled at him, that empty space where Marcus had lain. But Marcus wasn't there anymore. Marcus was in that ambulance, surrounded by people trying to save him. For the first time in 3 days, Atlas moved from his post. He climbed into the cruiser, and Sarah closed the door behind him, and they drove toward the hospital through a rain that was finally beginning to ease. But something still nagged at Atlas's instincts. Something beyond the illness he'd smelled, beyond the fall he'd witnessed. As the cruiser rolled through town, he pressed his nose to the window and tried to understand. Marcus had been walking that road for weeks. Always the same route, always the same time. And his symptoms had been getting worse, the breathlessness, the trembling, the copper smell that had grown stronger with each passing day. Why hadn't Marcus told anyone? Why hadn't he sought help? And why, on that particular morning, had he seemed so resigned? Almost peaceful despite the fear? As if he'd known what was coming. As if he'd chosen that road, that moment, for a reason. Atlas watched the hospital appear through the rain-streaked glass, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, more than anyone knew. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the timing. 3 days. Marcus Webb had been lying in that ravine for 3 days, and nobody had noticed he was missing. Not his colleagues, not his supervisors, not even his family. That didn't make sense. She sat in the hospital waiting room, Atlas pressed against her legs like a 70-pound shadow, and turned the problem over in her mind. Marcus was a 14-year veteran with an impeccable record. He showed up for every shift, attended every meeting, never missed a day without calling in. If he'd simply failed to appear at work, alarm bells should have rung immediately. But according to dispatch, no one had filed a missing person report. No one had even expressed concern. Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled through the department schedule. There it was, Marcus Webb, listed as being on approved personal leave for the entire week. Vacation days, it said. Family time. Except Marcus's family wasn't home. She'd called the Webb residence from the hospital expecting to deliver devastating news to a worried wife. Instead, She'd gotten voicemail. A cheerful message in a woman's voice. "Hi, you've reached the Webbs. Leave us a message and we'll call you back." That gave no indication of anything wrong. 3 more calls. 3 more voicemails. The same result from Marcus's parents, his sister, his emergency contacts. Where was everyone? A nurse appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. "Deputy Chen, Mr. Webb is out of surgery. He's stable but critical. The doctor would like to speak with you." Sarah rose, Atlas rising with her. The nurse eyed the dog uncertainly. "He's a K-9 officer," Sarah said. "Marcus's partner. He stays." Something in her tone must have conveyed the non-negotiability of this point, because the nurse simply nodded and led them down a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and fear. Dr. Aisha Patel was waiting outside the ICU, a small woman with tired eyes and capable hands, still wearing her surgical cap. She looked at Atlas first, and something softened in her expression. "The famous guardian," she said quietly. "The paramedics told me about him." 3 days? "At least," Sarah confirmed. "Maybe longer. We don't know exactly when Marcus fell." Dr. Patel nodded slowly, her gaze turning thoughtful. "That explains some things." "What do you mean?" "Come, I'll show you." They followed her into the ICU, past rows of beds filled with still forms and beeping machines. Marcus's room was at the end, a private space with a window overlooking the parking lot. Rain still streaked the glass, though the storm had faded to a gentle drizzle. Marcus lay motionless beneath a web of tubes and wires. His face was slack, his breathing mechanical, the ventilator doing work his lungs couldn't manage on their own. But he was alive. After 3 days in a ravine, after a cardiac event severe enough to drop him in his tracks, he was still alive. Atlas whined and pressed forward. Sarah let him go, watching as he approached the bed with the careful reverence of someone entering a church. He rose on his hind legs, just high enough to rest his chin on the mattress beside Marcus's hand, and went still. Dr. Patel observed this for a moment before turning to Sarah. "Mr. Webb suffered a massive myocardial infarction," she said quietly. "Heart attack in layman's terms. But the interesting thing is the timing. Based on the damage patterns, I'd estimate the initial event occurred at least 72 hours ago. Maybe longer. That's consistent with what we know. What's not consistent," Dr. Patel continued, "is that he survived it at all." Sarah frowned. "I don't understand. A heart attack of this magnitude, left untreated for 3 days? The mortality rate is essentially 100%. The heart tissue dies without blood flow. Without immediate intervention, the damage cascades until the organ simply fails." Dr. Patel paused, choosing her words carefully. "Mr. Webb should be dead. By every medical metric I know, he should have died within hours of the initial event. But he didn't. No, he didn't." The doctor glanced at Atlas, still motionless beside the bed. "I've been doing this job for 23 years, Deputy. I've seen things I can't explain, patients who defy every prognosis, who survive what should have killed them, and in my experience they all have one thing in common." "What's that?" "Something to live for. Someone waiting for them." Dr. Patel's voice was soft. "I think that dog kept him alive. Not metaphorically, literally. I think Marcus Webb knew his partner was out there standing guard, refusing to give up. And he refused to give up too." Sarah looked at Atlas, at the unwavering devotion in his posture, and felt something tighten in her chest. 3 days. 3 days of rain and cold and uncertainty, and this dog had maintained his vigil like a soldier, like a priest, like something holy. Had Marcus felt that? Even unconscious, even dying, had some part of him sensed Atlas's presence and clung to life because of it? The question would have seemed absurd a week ago. Now, standing in this room with its beeping machines and its impossible survivor, Sarah wasn't sure of anything anymore. "There's something else," Dr. Patel said, her tone shifting. "Something I need to show you." She led Sarah to a computer terminal in the corner and pulled up what looked like a medical record. The screen filled with numbers and charts, most of which meant nothing to Sarah's untrained eye. "These are Mr. Webb's blood work results," Dr. Patel explained. "Standard panel, plus some additional tests I ordered when I noticed certain anomalies." "Anomalies?" "His blood shows markers consistent with chronic poisoning." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Sarah felt the ripples spreading through her understanding, rearranging everything she thought she knew. "Poisoning?" she repeated. "You mean someone—" "I mean his system contains elevated levels of certain compounds that, over time, would cause progressive cardiac damage. Weakness, shortness of breath, eventual heart failure." Dr. Patel's expression was grim. "These aren't the kinds of compounds you encounter accidentally, Deputy. Someone had to introduce them into his system deliberately. Someone who had regular access to his food or drink." Sarah's mind raced through the implications. Marcus's wife, his family, the convenient vacation that had started just before his collapse, the fact that no one had reported him missing, no one had answered their phones, no one seemed to know or care that he'd been gone for 3 days. "Where's his family?" Sarah asked, her voice harder than she intended. "I was hoping you could tell me." Sarah turned back to Marcus, to his pale face and laboring lungs. Someone had done this to him, someone he trusted, someone who shared his home and his life. They'd poisoned him slowly, carefully, watching him weaken over weeks or months. And when the end had finally come, they'd made sure to be somewhere else. Somewhere with an alibi. They hadn't counted on Atlas. The dog had seen everything, had smelled the wrongness long before anyone else noticed, had tried to communicate his concern in the only ways he knew how. And when Marcus fell, Atlas had stood guard, refusing to leave, refusing to let his partner become just another missing person case that went cold and forgotten. Atlas had given them a chance to discover the truth. Sarah crouched beside the bed, bringing herself to eye level with the German shepherd. His gaze met hers, and once again she saw that ancient understanding, that depth that seemed to transcend species. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered. "You knew something was wrong." Atlas's tail moved, just once. Just slightly. Sarah straightened, her jaw setting with determination. Somewhere out there, Marcus Webb's family was running, convinced they'd gotten away with murder, confident that their crime would be written off as a tragic accident. They didn't know that a dog had been watching, and they didn't know that Sarah Chen was about to turn their careful plans to ash. "I need to make some calls," she told Dr. Patel. "Can you keep me updated on his condition?" "Of course." Sarah headed for the door, her mind already racing through next steps. APBs on the family vehicles, credit card traces, cell phone records, the tools of investigation, the weapons she'd used to bring justice to a man who'd nearly lost everything. But at the threshold, she paused and looked back. Atlas hadn't moved. He remained at Marcus's bedside, chin resting on the mattress, eyes fixed on his partner's face. Waiting. Still waiting. He would wait forever if he had to. Sarah understood that now. "I'll be back," she said, to Atlas, to Marcus, to herself. "I promise." The dog's ears twitched, acknowledging her words, and Sarah stepped out into the corridor, ready to hunt. Marcus Webb's wife was named Catherine, and she had made exactly one mistake. Sarah discovered it at 3:47 in the morning, hunched over a computer in the sheriff's station, running on coffee and cold fury. The mistake was small, a gas station purchase in Nevada, charged to a credit card Catherine had apparently forgotten she still shared with her husband. Nevada, 700 miles from the ravine where Marcus had lain dying, Far enough to establish distance, close enough to reach within a day's drive. Catherine Webb wasn't running scared. She was running calculated. Sarah pulled up everything she could find on the woman, 41 years old, former pharmaceutical technician, a detail that sent ice down Sarah's spine. 2 children from a previous marriage, both teenagers now, both conspicuously absent from recent social media posts. Married to Marcus for 8 years. 8 years. Long enough to know his routines, long enough to study his physiology, long enough to plan. The motive remained unclear, but Sarah had learned that motives often revealed themselves once you started pulling threads. Right now, she needed to focus on the pursuit. She called the Nevada State Police, explained the situation, and was transferred 4 times before finding a detective who took her seriously. His name was Rodriguez, and his voice carried the weary competence of someone who'd seen everything twice. "Suspected poisoning resulting in attempted murder," he repeated. "Wife fled the state before the victim was discovered. And you found all this because a dog wouldn't leave the body?" "Canine officer," Sarah corrected. "And yes." A pause. Then, "I love this job sometimes. Send me what you've got. I'll put out feelers." Sarah sent everything: the gas station receipt, Catherine's photo, her vehicle information, a detailed summary of the medical findings. Then she sat back and waited, watching the clock tick toward dawn. She must have dozed because the next thing she knew, her phone was buzzing against the desk. "Deputy Chen? This is Dr. Patel. You asked me to update you on Mr. Webb's condition." Sarah jerked upright, heart hammering. "Is he—" "He's awake." The words took a moment to process. "He's awake? Already?" "Against all medical logic, yes. He's weak, and he's on significant medication, but he's conscious and coherent." A pause. "He's asking about his dog." Sarah was in her car within minutes, racing through streets that were just beginning to stir with early morning traffic. The hospital parking lot was nearly empty, and she found a spot close to the entrance. She didn't remember walking through the doors, riding the elevator, navigating the corridors. She only remembered arriving at Marcus's room and finding him propped up in bed, his eyes tired but alert. Atlas was beside him. Someone had lifted the dog onto the mattress, against protocol surely, but who was going to argue? And Marcus's hand rested on his partner's head, fingers moving in slow, gentle strokes. "Deputy Chen," Marcus said. His voice was rough, barely above a whisper, but there was warmth in it. "They told me what you did. What Atlas did." Sarah moved to his bedside. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck, then backed over for good measure." He attempted a smile. "But I'm alive. They tell me that's something of a miracle." "The doctors say your dog might have had something to do with that." Marcus's hand stilled on Atlas's fur. He looked down at the German shepherd, and something shifted in his expression. A weight settling, an acknowledgement of things too large for words. "He would never give up on me," Marcus said softly. "I knew that. Even when I couldn't feel my body, couldn't see or hear anything, I knew he was there." "I could feel him waiting." Sarah let the silence stretch before speaking again. "Mr. Webb, Marcus, I need to ask you some questions. About your wife." The change was immediate. Marcus's jaw tightened, and his gaze dropped to the blankets. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "What about her?" "She's not here. She hasn't been reachable since you were found. We discovered she purchased gas in Nevada 12 hours after you collapsed." Sarah watched his face carefully. "The doctors found evidence of poisoning in your blood, long-term exposure to compounds that would cause progressive heart damage." Marcus didn't respond. His hand had stopped moving entirely, frozen on Atlas's back. "Did you know?" Sarah pressed gently. "Did you suspect something was wrong?" For a long moment he was silent. Then slowly, he nodded. "About a month ago," he said, "I started noticing that my symptoms got worse on certain days when Catherine made my coffee instead of letting me make it myself. I thought I was being paranoid. I thought, what did you think? I thought I was dying anyway. I thought it didn't matter how fast it happened." Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. Dying anyway? "I was diagnosed with a heart condition 6 months ago. Genetic. Incurable. The doctors gave me, not long. A year, maybe 2 if I was lucky." Marcus's voice was flat, reciting facts as if they belonged to someone else. "Catherine knew. She was the first person I told." The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. A dying husband with a life insurance policy. A wife who knew about pharmaceuticals. A slow poisoning that would look like natural progression of an existing disease. "She wasn't willing to wait," Sarah said. "No." Marcus's voice cracked. "I guess she wasn't. Why didn't you report your suspicions?" He was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he did, his words were barely audible. "Because part of me thought I deserved it." Atlas whined and pressed closer to his partner. Marcus's hand resumed its movement, finding comfort in the familiar texture of fur. "I wasn't a good husband," he continued. "The job, the long hours, the constant danger, it wears on a marriage. Catherine wanted things I couldn't give her. Stability, attention. A partner who came home at 5 and left his work at the door." His laugh was bitter. "She said once that I loved Atlas more than I loved her. She wasn't entirely wrong. That doesn't justify—" "No, it doesn't. But when you're dying, when you know every day might be your last, you start making strange bargains with yourself. You start thinking maybe it's okay if things end a little sooner. Maybe it's easier for everyone." Sarah thought of the road, the familiar route Marcus walked every morning, the way he'd seemed peaceful, almost resigned, in the moments before his collapse. "That morning," she said slowly, "when you went for your walk, you knew, didn't you? You knew something was going to happen." Marcus met her eyes for the first time since she'd started asking questions. "I felt it," he admitted. "The heaviness in my chest, the numbness in my arm. I'd felt it building for days, and I knew it was coming." He swallowed hard. "I thought about staying home. Calling someone, getting help. But then I looked at Atlas and he was so excited for our walk, and I thought, if I'm going to die, I want it to be out there, in the open, with him." "You chose that road on purpose." "I chose him." Marcus's voice broke. "I chose to spend my last moments with the only being who'd ever loved me without conditions, without expectations, without wanting anything except to be by my side." Tears were sliding down his weathered cheeks now, disappearing into the stubble on his jaw. "I didn't think anyone would find us. I didn't think it would matter. I just wanted to not be alone when it happened." Atlas lifted his head and licked the tears from his partner's face. The gesture was so tender, so deeply intimate, that Sarah had to look away. "But it did matter," she said softly. "You're alive, Marcus. Atlas kept you alive." "He shouldn't have had to, but he did. He sat in the rain for 3 days because he wasn't ready to let you go. Because you matter to him." Sarah moved closer, forcing Marcus to meet her gaze. "You matter, not just to him, to everyone who's going to hear this story. To the kids you've saved, the criminals you've caught, the community you've protected for 14 years. You don't get to decide your life isn't worth fighting for. Not when there's a dog who spent 3 days proving that it is." Marcus stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, something shifted behind his eyes. A crack in the wall of resignation he'd built around himself. A sliver of light where there had been only darkness. "Catherine," he said, "where is she?" "Nevada, as of 12 hours ago. We've got people looking." "She'll run farther. She's smart. Smarter than me. She'll have planned for contingencies. Then help me. Help me understand how she thinks, where she'd go, what she'd do. Marcus was quiet, considering. His hand moved methodically over Atlas's fur, the rhythm of a man sorting through memories he'd rather forget. She has a sister, he finally said. In Oregon. They're not close. Haven't spoken in years. But Catherine always talked about her like she was the one who got away. The life she could have had if she'd made different choices. You think she'd go there? I think she'd want to. Whether she actually would. He shook his head. Catherine is careful. She wouldn't risk leading anyone to her sister unless she was desperate. But if things got bad enough, if she felt cornered. Sarah was already reaching for her phone. What's the sister's name? Patricia. Patricia Holbrook. She lives somewhere outside Portland. I don't know the exact address. It was enough. Sarah stepped into the hallway, dialing Rodriguez's number with fingers that trembled slightly. The pieces were falling into place. The picture was forming. Catherine Webb thought she'd escaped. Thought she'd left her dying husband in a ditch where no one would find him until it was far too late. Thought she'd gotten away clean. But she'd forgotten about Atlas. And now, because of a dog's unwavering loyalty, her entire careful plan was unraveling. Rodriguez answered on the third ring. Deputy Chen, I was just about to call you. I have a lead. The sister... Save it. We already found her. Sarah's breath caught. Catherine? Highway patrol pulled her over about an hour ago. Routine traffic stop. She was doing 90 in a 70 zone. Guess she was in a hurry. Rodriguez's voice carried grim satisfaction. She's in custody. She's not talking, but we've got enough for the warrant. State police are searching her vehicle now. And? They found a bag in her trunk. Contains what appears to be pharmaceutical-grade digitalis compounds. Same stuff your doctors found in the husband's blood. A pause. She's done, Deputy. It's over. Sarah sagged against the wall, relief flooding through her like water through a broken dam. Over. It was over. There's something else, Rodriguez added. Something that might interest you. What? When they arrested her, she didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't ask about her rights. The first thing she said, the only thing she said was, "That damn dog." Rodriguez chuckled darkly. I think she figured out what went wrong. Sarah ended the call and stood for a moment in the fluorescent quiet of the hospital corridor. Through the window in Marcus's door, she could see him lying in bed, Atlas still pressed against his side. Two partners, reunited against impossible odds, two halves of a whole that refused to be broken. She pushed open the door. They got her, Sarah said. Catherine's in custody. They found the poison in her car. Marcus's eyes closed. Not in relief exactly, something more complicated. Something that looked like grief. The kids, he murmured. Her kids from her first marriage, they're good kids. This is going to destroy them. They're being located now. Child Services will make sure they're safe. Will they, though? Will they ever be safe again, knowing what their mother did? Marcus opened his eyes, and they were wet again. I keep thinking about all the people this touches. All the lives that get destroyed because someone decided they couldn't wait, couldn't be patient, couldn't just let things end naturally. That's not on you, isn't it? He looked at Atlas, who had lifted his head at the change in his partner's tone. Maybe if I'd been a better husband. Maybe if I'd seen the signs earlier. Maybe if I'd... Stop! Sarah's voice was sharp enough to cut through his spiral. You didn't do this. You didn't poison anyone. You didn't flee the state. You didn't leave someone to die alone in a ditch. That was her choice. Her crime. You're the victim here, Marcus. Not the cause. He stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly, he nodded. I know, he said quietly. I know that, logically, but logic doesn't always reach the places that hurt. Atlas whined again and shifted his weight, pressing more firmly against Marcus's side. The message was clear. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. And for the first time since Sarah had walked into this room, she saw something like hope flicker in Marcus Webb's eyes. What happens now? He asked. Now you rest, you heal, you let the doctors do their job. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. And when you're strong enough, you tell your story. Because people need to hear it. The story about a man who almost died because his wife couldn't wait for nature to take its course? The story about a dog who refused to give up. The story about loyalty that defied death. The story about finding light in the darkest places. Sarah glanced at Atlas. His story as much as yours. Marcus's hand found its way to Atlas's head again, fingers threading through the familiar fur. Yeah, he said softly. Yeah, I guess it is. 6 months later, the courtroom was packed. Atlas sat at Marcus's feet, his training collar replaced with a simple leather one, retirement gear for a dog who had given everything to his partner and his profession. The cancer that would have killed Marcus had been treated aggressively once doctors discovered the poisoning had masked its symptoms. Ironically, Catherine's impatience had forced medical intervention that might never have happened otherwise. He would live. The doctors said he would live. And today, he would watch justice delivered. Catherine Webb sat at the defendant's table, her orange jumpsuit a sharp contrast to the designer clothes she'd worn in their wedding photos. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by months in custody, by the weight of evidence stacked against her. She hadn't taken a plea deal. She'd insisted on trial, insisted on her innocence, insisted that Marcus had poisoned himself for attention. The jury hadn't believed her. Atlas watched the proceedings with the patient stillness he'd perfected during 3 days at the roadside. He didn't understand the words, the legal terminology, the procedural formalities, the careful dance of closing arguments. But he understood the rhythms of the room, the tension that built as the judge prepared to read the verdict, the held breaths, the rigid postures, the way Marcus's hand tightened on his leash. On the count of attempted murder in the first degree, the judge intoned, we find the defendant guilty. A murmur swept through the gallery. Catherine's head dropped, her shoulders beginning to shake. At the prosecutor's table, Sarah Chen, who had taken personal interest in the case from the beginning, allowed herself a small nod of satisfaction. Atlas felt Marcus's relief through the leash, a loosening of the tension that had gripped his partner for months. An exhalation that seemed to release more than just air. They didn't stay for the sentencing hearing. They didn't need to. 25 years to life, the attorneys had told them. Longer than Marcus had expected to live when all this began. Outside the courthouse, autumn sunlight filtered through changing leaves. Marcus breathed deep, filling his lungs with air that tasted like freedom. How do you feel? Sarah asked, falling into step beside them. Like waking up from a nightmare. Marcus looked down at Atlas, who was pressing against his leg with familiar devotion. Like realizing the nightmare's over. It is. Sarah crouched to scratch behind Atlas's ears. The dog leaned into her touch, accepting the affection with the quiet dignity he brought to everything. I never got to thank you properly, you know, for leading me to him. Atlas's tail moved. Just once. Just slightly. He doesn't need thanks, Marcus said. He did what he was trained to do, what he was born to do. He paused, something shifting in his expression. You know what kept me going those 3 days? When I was lying at the bottom of that ravine, feeling my heart give out, feeling everything slip away. What? I could hear him. Even when I couldn't see or move or think, I could hear him up there on the road.
This quiet presence, just waiting. And I thought, he's not going to leave. He's going to stay until someone finds us, or until he dies trying. And if he can do that for me, the least I can do is keep breathing. Sarah straightened, blinking against unexpected moisture in her eyes. That's quite a partnership. It's more than that. It's... Marcus searched for words, his hand finding Atlas's head again. It's the only truly unconditional love I've ever known. No expectations. No disappointments. No questions about what I could give in return. Just loyalty. Just presence. Just being there. They walked in silence for a while, the courthouse fading behind them. The park across the street was busy with lunch hour crowds, parents pushing strollers, children chasing each other across the grass, dogs straining at leashes toward invisible rabbits. Atlas watched it all with calm interest. He was still technically a K-9 officer, still carried the training and instincts that had made him exceptional at his job. But the department had agreed to let him retire alongside Marcus, honoring the partnership that had survived what should have been unsurvivable. They were partners. Always had been. Always would be. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked. Marcus considered the question. 2 months ago, he wouldn't have had an answer. The diagnosis had stolen his future. Catherine's betrayal had stolen his present, and the ravine had nearly stolen his life. He'd been a man with nothing left to lose. But that was before Atlas had shown him what loyalty really meant, before a 3-day vigil had reminded him that some bonds transcend circumstance, before he'd been given a second chance he'd never expected. "I think," Marcus said slowly, "I'd like to train dogs." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Train dogs?" "K-9 handlers. New partnerships." He looked down at Atlas with something like wonder. "Everyone told me what to look for when I chose him. Pedigree, scores, physical markers. But that's not what makes a good team. That's not what makes a dog sit in the rain for 3 days waiting for someone to find you. What does? Heart." Marcus's voice was thick. "You can't train heart. You can't breed it. You can only recognize it when you see it. And I want to spend whatever time I have left teaching people how to see it." Atlas looked up at his partner, and something passed between them. Something silent and ancient and deeper than language. An understanding that had been forged in blood and rain and 3 impossible days. They had been to the edge together. They had stared into the void, and they had pulled each other back. That was worth something. That was worth everything. "I think that's a beautiful idea," Sarah said softly. Marcus smiled. A real smile. The first one that had felt genuine in months. "Yeah, I think so too." They parted ways at the edge of the park. Sarah headed back to the station, to the endless paperwork and daily crises that made up her job. Marcus and Atlas continued toward their car, an old pickup truck that had been gathering dust in the garage during Catherine's tenure. She'd hated that truck. Too dirty, too rough, too much like the man she'd married and grown to resent. But Marcus had kept it, and now it felt like reclaiming a piece of himself he'd thought was lost. He opened the passenger door, and Atlas jumped in without hesitation. The dog settled into his familiar spot, nose pressed to the window, eyes bright with anticipation. "You know where we're going, don't you?" Marcus said, sliding behind the wheel. Atlas's tail thumped against the seat. They drove in comfortable silence, past the hospital where Marcus had been reborn, past the sheriff's station where Sarah had connected the dots, past the turn that would have taken them to the house he'd shared with Catherine. That house was for sale now, its ghosts too heavy to carry. Finally, they reached County Road 9. Marcus pulled over at mile marker 47. The grass had been mowed since that rainy week 6 months ago, but the ravine was still there, a scar in the landscape that would always hold meaning. He got out, and Atlas followed, and they stood together at the edge of the road. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. A hawk circled lazily overhead. The air smelled like cut grass and distant rain and something else. Something that might have been endings or might have been beginnings. "This is where you saved my life," Marcus said quietly. "This is where everything changed." Atlas leaned against his leg, a warm and solid presence that had never faltered, never wavered, never given up. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life being worthy of that," Marcus continued. "However long that is, however much time we have. I'm going to be the person you see when you look at me." The dog tilted his head, considering this. Then slowly he rose on his hind legs and placed his paws on Marcus's shoulders, a gesture he'd made 1,000 times in greeting, but which felt different now. More deliberate, more meaningful. Marcus wrapped his arms around his partner and held on. They stayed like that as the sun dipped below the horizon, two silhouettes against the dying light. A man and his dog. A partnership that had defied death. A love that asked for nothing and gave everything. The vigil was over. But the journey was just beginning. 3 years later, the Marcus Webb Canine Training Foundation would graduate its first class of handlers and dogs. Each team would receive, at graduation, a simple leather collar with a brass tag bearing a single word: Atlas. And in the corner of every training field, a retired German shepherd would watch with ancient eyes, still standing guard, still keeping vigil, still teaching what it meant to never give up. Some bonds cannot be broken. Some loyalties transcend death itself. And some dogs sit by the roadside for 3 days straight, because that is simply what love does.